Omer Ozkizilcik, he is an analyst with the security department of the Seta Foundation. He joins us now from Ankara. Thanks for speaking to us. You know, the Russian delegation that's in Ankara, it had been hoped that some kind of diplomatic solution would be found, that at least some kind of ceasefire could have been agreed. Have these meetings yielded anything?
So obviously the attack of today against the Turkish armed force, which killed 5 Turkish soldiers, is a clear indicator that the meetings of the two delegations have not come to a solution yet. And I personally do not expect that both sides will agree upon a joint solution for the Idlib case, as the differences are just too big. Because from the Russian perspective, it's Turkey who is not fulfilling the agreements of Astana and Sochi. But from the Turkish perspective and from the perspective of the law, it's Russia and the Assad regime who does not fulfill the terms of agreement. A ceasefire was the very first term of agreement in these agreements. However, what happened today? So the attack does follow a certain procedure. At the morning before the meeting of the Turkish and Russian delegation started, small Syrian opposition forces supported by Turkish artillery and supplied with Turkish armored vehicles started a small raid and attack against the Assad regime forces near Sarakib, a city which has still Turkish troops inside it, although it's been completely controlled by the Assad regime at the very moment. So after this small attack, the Turkish armed force stopped it and then gave the space for negotiations, clearly indicating that the Turkish armed force are ready to enforce the Sochi agreement by military force if necessary. However, with the end of the negotiations, the Assad regime attacked the Turkish armed force, and this is, from my perspective, a kind of declaration of war. And we have to wait and see how the Turkish armed force and the Turkish presidency will decide how to respond to this. But I do not see a possible pathway towards a peaceful solution in Idlib, which will secure 3.3 million civilians there, except for a military one, which can only be conducted by the Turkish armed force.
Okay. I mean, because the Assad regime is very close to really reclaiming the entire country now. Why would they stop now? Why would they stop at Idlib?
Yeah, they do not have any reason to stop except for the threat of the Turkish armed force. So we have to clearly assess that the deployment of the Turkish soldiers into Idlib is as big as never before. There were 3 different military operations conducted by the Turkish armed force in Syria. None of them had so big supplies. None of them had so many armored vehicles, so many tanks. So Turkey is going in full blow, and Turkey has already warned the Russian and regime side that Turkey will enforce the withdrawal of the Assad regime back to the Sochi front lines of Sochi. However, I think Russia and the Assad regime are betting on something wrong. They are betting that the Turks are bluffing, but I'm quite sure that the Turkish government is not, as the situation in Idlib is not only a national security threat, but also a threat which will create massive chaos in Turkey if it cannot be prevented.
Okay. Is there any question, though, that the Assad regime listens to Russia? I mean, in other words, if Russia says stop, the regime will stop, correct?
Yes, there is no other way, because we know for a long time that Russian special forces are highly embedded with the regime militias on the ground. The air strikes of the Assad regime are entirely coordinated with the Russians. All of the military preparations, supplies, ammunition, and operations and tactics and strategies are being orchestrated by the Russians. So if the Russians say stop to the Assad regime has to stop, because without the support of the Russians or without the active support of the Russians, the Assad regime does not have the capacity to stand against the Syrian opposition alone. So the Syrian opposition is much better in warfare and on the ground fighting than the militias of the Assad regime. However, it's the Russians who make the balance of power in favor of the Assad regime. So for a long time, even the Iranians are not as much influential on the Assad regime army as it's the Russians. And since 6 months and a bit more, the Russians have put much effort into restructuring and reorganizing the regime's army. So the generals, the commanders on the field are all pro-Russian figures.
Okay, Omer Ozkizilcik, thank you so much for joining us there from Ankara. We appreciate it.